Sam M says, how would you adjust? And we have 2 questions about this. We're going to cover 2 questions with 1 statement. So I'll read both questions and then we'll talk about the answer. How would you adjust the deadly encounter benchmark to account for enemies coming in waves instead of all being present in the beginning? I feel like there should be some sort of upward adjustment to account for the enemy's reduced damage output and the ability to focus fire. Obviously, doing too much math is antithetical to the lazy DM approach, but if you or anyone has found a quick rule of thumb, like the deadly benchmark for each wave is 1/2 of the normal deadly benchmark, that would be great. I'm confident my hypothetical example would not work, just using as an illustration. And Syrian O says, I've recently been thinking about encountering benchmark as players are getting into high levels and have more resources to spend. I've been using the lazy encounter benchmark to great success in my campaign. Still, my 6 players are about to hit level 9, and I'd like to start incorporating back-to-back gauntlet-style encounters. More waves of combatants. Think fighting through the courtyard, up the castle steps, and encountering the boss inside to save the prisoners. I'm curious how you might budget the difficulty of a set of combat encounters in order to mitigate the number of dials you're adjusting mid-combat, and ideally to avoid the total wipe at the boss stage. So both of those are really kind of hitting the same question, which is when you take encounters and you sort of mash them together, how does the encounter benchmark work? So number 1 rule with the encounter benchmark is that the lazy encounter benchmark, by the way, if you want to know more about the lazy encounter benchmark, you can find a link in the show notes. A quick abbreviation of the lazy encounter benchmark is after you have built a combat encounter and you want to determine if it could be potentially deadly, you compare the sum total of challenge ratings of monsters to the total of character levels. An encounter may be deadly if the sum total of monster challenge ratings is greater than 1/4 of the sum total of character levels if they are 4th level or below. If they're above 5th level, or if they're 5th level and above, it's half of character levels. So what you do is you add up all of your character levels and divide it by 4, and that's your deadly encounter benchmark for characters 4th level and below. And if your sum total of monster challenge ratings is greater than that number, you are in danger territory. You do it at half of character levels if the characters are 5th level and above. So you add all your character levels together. So an example is, let's say you have 5 6th level characters. That's, if you add all the character levels together, you have 30. You divide that in half and it's 15. That tells you the sum total of monster challenge ratings that you could have in a battle before things go into the danger zone. It doesn't work for a single monster. If you want to know if a single monster is going to be too hard, a single monster may be deadly if its challenge rating is 150% of the average of character levels. So if you have 6 level characters and if you have a CR 9 monster or CR 10 monster, that's when you're getting into the danger territory. Now, all it is like a gauge. It's not saying it absolutely will be deadly and you're totally wrong. Don't ever do it. It's saying it's just going to be very, very dangerous, and it could be potentially deadly if you cross that threshold. So that's the key to the encounter balance. That's the key to the lazy encounter benchmark. Again, you can find a link to it in the show notes if you want more details on that. But when it comes to using it for waves, we want to keep in mind that this is a loose gauge. It's not a perfect representation of how things work. And instead, what I would do is I would still break things down into the individual encounters, even if you have a bunch of waves, and look at the deadly encounter benchmark for each of those encounters and say, is this one going over deadly? Is this one going over deadly? And is this one going over deadly? And then you get a gauge, and you can say like, okay, one's going to be easier, one's going to be harder, or something like that. The key to waves of combatants is how much time do the characters have between waves? So if the characters kill their last monster before the next first monster shows up, that's going to be easier than if they overlap where you've only killed half of the current monsters and a whole other wave of monsters comes in. So the difficulty here is going to escalate depending on how close together those encounters go. If they have the equivalent of a short rest between those encounters, they're going to be significantly easier than if they have one encounter right after the other with no opportunity for a rest. That's where you want to look at each encounter and say, okay, this could be even deadlier. There's no good math that's going to get you there. There isn't a formula like 1/2 of the normal deadly benchmark. You probably don't want to have each one of them be deadly. And you might want to say, I'm going to save the deadly one for the end. But this is where the dials of monster difficulty really matter. And the interesting thing is when you're running waves of combatants, you have access to a dial you typically don't, which is the number of monsters. And you have a whole other dial you can use, which is how close together are these waves. And while you're running the battle, you can gauge, like, do I want to put the pressure on? In which case I'm going to have a wave come in early. Do I want to take the pressure off? In which case I'm going to have a wave come later. Do I want to reduce the pressure adventure overall by reducing the number of monsters that I was expecting to run? Or did they have a really easy time and now I'm going to increase it? And in between each wave, you can turn these dials. You can decide, do I want to compress the total battles together? Do I want to extend them out? Do I want to reduce monsters or increase monsters? And then of course you have the other dials of increasing or decreasing their hit points, increasing or decreasing their number of attacks, and increasing or decreasing the amount of damage they do. All of those dials you have to get that battle to feel the way you think it should feel for the situation that's going on and for the fun of the game. But there's the benchmarks I would still use the benchmark on individual waves just to give you a gauge of how they are. Are they half of what the deadly benchmark is? Okay, they're probably going to be pretty easy for that wave. Are they equal to the deadly benchmark or above it? Those are going to be pretty hard. And then if you really want, if they're having an easy time, you stack it together. One important point, I probably wouldn't run waves of combatants against characters that are below 5th level unless they're really, really weaker. So you could, but you're definitely going to want to dial down the difficulty of those battles because characters that are 4th level and below don't have a lot of ways to handle a lot of monsters. 5th level and above, you get spells like Fireball. You get, multiple attacks for a lot of the melee classes. You have access to things that can help you handle waves of combatants that you don't really have when you're 1st to 4th level. So that's one thing to consider for the waves of combatants is be a lot nicer about them below 4th level or 4th level or below. And then when they hit 5th level, you can start to dial them up. So I hope this answers the question about how to run waves of combatants and how it kind of works with the lazy encounter benchmark. The key is you have the benchmark on one side and you have the dials of monster difficulty on the other, and you can use these things together to really tune a battle the way you want. The interesting thing about waves is you have a 5th dial, and that 5th dial is how compressed are the battles? How much do they overlap with one another? I think that can really work. So Sam and Sierra, I hope that answered your questions.